You say Paul is not under the law of Moses. What about Acts 21? So this is Paul's, I believe it's his last visit to Jerusalem. And I believe James confronts him and says that he's been disturbing the faith of many, a myriad Jews who have accepted Jesus as their promised Messiah. And then he's asking him, is this true? And Paul doesn't, we don't get Paul's response. James just keeps talking. And then he says to Paul, take this man, so there were other men there, join in their purification rites, pay their expenses, so that they can have their heads shaved. So they, I don't know what these guys did, but they have to, according to the Torah, purify themselves. Then everyone, says James, will know there is no truth in these reports about you. And the reports were that he was teaching Jewish children to apostatize from Moses, that is, cut themselves off from Moses. So they see that you yourself are living in obedience to the Torah, to the law.
We start then with Paul's statement in 1 Corinthians 9. To the Jews now, I became like a Jew to win Jews. To those under the law, I became like a Jew who's under the law. Although I, Paul, myself, am not under the law. I did this to win those who are under the law. I hope that's clear. It does not say anything about not being under the penalty of the law. That's a completely fake news translation. He says, I, Paul, am not under the law of Moses. He's willing to do all kinds of diplomatic things like circumcising Timothy because of the Jews. He'll do it if it helps to keep them happy. He's willing to go and do that ceremonial thing that you just had there in Acts. But Paul himself is not under the law. Now, let me give you the strongest quotation of Paul. I'll quote it exactly in Galatians. If I were still teaching circumcision, which I'm not, why am I being persecuted? That demonstrates to anybody listening to Galatians that Paul was not, I repeat, not teaching circumcision. That's quite clear, because if he were teaching circumcision, he wouldn't be persecuted. But as it is, Paul himself makes it clear. I think that James was not as advanced as Paul at that juncture. It took them, even Peter wavered. You remember that? Peter couldn't get this clear. He started separating himself from Gentiles. It took a special event to convince Peter and eventually got it straight. James, I think, was a little bit slower than Paul. Paul is advanced beyond all of them. And so he's willing to do anything diplomatically while still himself not being under the law of Moses in the letter. So what law is Paul under? He says it, the law of Messiah. The key to all of this is you must understand the difference between the law of Moses in the letter and the law of Messiah in the spirit. Paul says, don't imagine I'm completely lawless. Of course not. But I'm under the law of Messiah, which is not, I repeat, not, and underlined it 100 times. It's not the same as the law of Moses. So just going to the 10 Commandments and saying, well, I'm keeping the 10 Commandments, you aren't there yet. That's the law of Moses. The Sabbath, for example, is a key sign of the old covenant. You, as a Christian, are to be under the new covenant. So don't take upon yourself the sign of the old covenant. That makes no sense at all. You have to learn what the law of Christ is by studying the New Testament, and increasingly then with Paul, who developed some things even beyond what Jesus said, because Jesus said there's certain things I can't even tell you yet. Paul is the one who develops this most clearly.
So a couple of questions, Anthony. So basically you're saying that Paul is telling us here that he's a diplomat, even with the Jerusalem church in Acts 21.
Yes.
That he's willing to become like a Jew.
Absolutely.
In order to win Jews.
Of course.
Now, a couple of objections to this that I have heard is, well, that sounds deceitful. Paul is giving with one hand and taking away with the other. How would you deal with that one first?
Well, I don't think Paul is deceitful for a start. Paul is an apostle writing a great deal of the New Testament. He's not deceiving anybody. The only way I can explain it, because the alternative is impossible, to say Paul is deceitful is accusing Paul. I'm not going to do that. That's not an option. He's being super diplomatic. So he takes these men, purifies himself to show that he's willing to do all of these legal things. But the other texts in Galatians must also be reckoned with. They're not necessary. The key is that he's not under the law of Moses. Paul is not under the law of Moses. He isn't lawless, however, and he's also willing to do legal stuff if it keeps you happy. But he himself is not bound by the law of Moses. I agree the difficulty is there. I see the difficulty, And I think the only solution is that Paul is clear when he says, if I were still teaching circumcision, which I am not, then why am I being persecuted? Paul recognizes he was being persecuted by the Jewish roots people for not teaching physical circumcision, which was certainly mandated for Jew and Gentile alike. That's a brand new thing. No physical circumcision. You want to do it for medical reasons, that's completely different. There's no obligation to be under the law of Moses in the letter. In fact, you're dangerously wrong if you do it, because you're taking yourself under the shadow of the wrong covenants as a Christian.
Right. Another objection I've heard, Anthony, to the diplomat Paul of First Corinthians 9 is that this event, this is Paul's last visit, I believe, to Jerusalem.
Yes.
And this takes place almost 10 years, I believe the chronology is, after the Council of Jerusalem
in 49
of the events in Acts 15. It's been a while. So one objection I've heard is, well, why isn't Paul just sitting down with James and the elders and just saying, hey, look, it's been 10 years, whatever. You guys are still not getting it. So why doesn't he do that instead of putting himself in a situation where now we have to, defend his actions here years after the council where they sent this letter out. By the way, James does say, verse 25 here in Acts 21, it reiterates that they sent Gentiles the decision not to come under Torah, which is interesting.
That's exactly right. The alternative is to say Paul was a deceiver. I'm not going to go there. So the only explanation I can offer you is that he's super diplomatic. That might be more of a British style, I don't know. It's not deceit. And he doesn't at this point explain everything. You're right. But in the book of Galatians, he had in fact explained it.
Right. It goes to that second objection that he's gone through Galatia. He's gone through Asia Minor. This is his last visit to Jerusalem. So he's written all these letters. He's very bold in those letters about you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched. I mean, he is tough. But here he sort of reverts to this sort of diplomat sort of. Now, the other final thing, Anthony, it talks about reports here that James and the church at Jerusalem have been getting about Paul. So you see the word there in the NIV translates as reports, New Living Translation as rumors. Is that right? Were those rumors about Paul spreading anti-Torah sentiments to little Jewish children true or false?
It was true that Paul was not teaching circumcision for anybody.
So James was right to confront Paul and say, look, our people are in turmoil here because you're teaching no circumcision, you're not teaching the Torah. So those reports were right.
I think they were indeed. And Paul doesn't confront the issue flat out there. Otherwise, I'm not able to harmonize Galatians at all with this. I know that's difficult. So be it. James didn't know either. He wasn't on board with this yet. Right. Peter, as we know, was an apostle who also didn't get it. He had to be corrected by Paul.
You keep mentioning the letter to the Galatians. It's not just Galatians, it's Colossians, it's Corinthians.
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
Even if you take the letter of Hebrews, I mean, so it's a whole bunch of letters. So it's tough to see it the other way.
I think it's a question of the alternative. The only alternative is to say that somebody's completely wrong here. I'd rather go with the idea of Paul being super diplomatic and for his own best reasons, deciding not to confront James at that point.
And a lot of Sabbatarian Christians, a lot of Jewish scholars, this is very difficult for them, this passage in 1 Corinthians 9. They don't know how to, some of them circumvent the language, some of them twist, I would say, in my humble opinion. So this is very clear here. That Paul is telling us what he's doing, what his method is, and they just can't deal with it. So you have to take that into consideration.
No, I do, and I would reemphasize what we just said. I myself am not under the law. That's what that says. It does not say, which would be a very stupid thing to say, by the way. I'll go to a Jew who is under the law or under the penalty of the law, and I will be under the penalty of the law too. No, that's just wrong.